By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was already defeated. Its cities were in ruins, its armies were exhausted, and its collapse was no longer a matter of if, only when. Yet in Hungary, Adolf Hitler ordered one final attack, not to win the war, but to delay its end. Near Lake Balaton, the Third Reich gathered the last of its armored reserves, elite SS divisions, experienced tank crews, and the final usable fuel stockpiles Germany had left. This was not a defensive stand, and not a symbolic gesture. It was a full-scale offensive, launched at a moment when Germany could least afford another failure. Hitler believed that one decisive blow could stabilize the front, secure the remaining Hungarian oil fields, and buy time the Reich no longer had. If the attack succeeded, Vienna would remain out of reach, Soviet momentum could be slowed, and the road to Berlin might stay closed just a little longer. But what followed was not a miracle, and not a turning point. It was the final proof that Germany had lost the ability to shape the war. Operation Spring Awakening would become the last major offensive of the Third Reich, and the moment when the war in Europe became truly irreversible. By early March 1945, the Red Army was already deep inside Central Europe. Budapest had fallen after a brutal siege. Romania and Bulgaria were out of the war, and Soviet forces were preparing to advance toward Vienna and Prague. Germany was bleeding on every front. Its industry was shattered, its manpower exhausted, and its air force barely existed. Yet in Hungary, something unusual was happening. While most German units were retreating or collapsing, entire armored divisions were moving toward Lake Balaton. This was not a defensive regrouping. It was preparation for attack. Hitler had chosen Hungary for one last gamble because of one critical factor: oil. The Nagy Kanisa oil fields near Balaton were the last significant fuel source still available to the Reich. Without them, German tanks, aircraft, and vehicles would simply stop moving. To Hitler, losing Hungary meant losing the war instantly. So he ordered everything that could still fight to be thrown into a single operation. Elite Waffen-SS divisions were pulled from the Western Front. Veteran tank crews were rushed east, even units still rebuilding after the Ardennes were sent south. The plan was simple in theory and desperate in reality. German forces would strike through the muddy terrain north of Lake Balaton, smash through Soviet lines, cross the Danube, and relieve pressure on Budapest's former sector. If successful, the offensive would push the Red Army back, secure the oil fields, and delay the Soviet advance toward Austria. Hitler believed this attack could change the strategic situation. But the reality on the ground was far harsher. Soviet intelligence already knew something was coming. Reconnaissance flights spotted armor concentrations. Prisoners talked. Radio traffic increased. By the time German units finished assembling, the Red Army was waiting. What Hitler called Germany's last hope was about to collide with an enemy that was stronger, better supplied, and prepared for exactly this kind of attack. By the time Operation Spring Awakening was ready to begin, Germany had concentrated almost everything it still considered elite near Lake Balaton. This was not the broken infantry of the Volkssturm or exhausted rear units. These were hardened formations, the 6th SS Panzer Army under SS Obergruppenführer Josef Dittrich, supported by the 6th Army and elements of the 2nd Panzer Army. Many of these units had just fought in the Ardennes and were still rebuilding, but Hitler demanded speed, not readiness. The core of the offensive was made up of Germany's most powerful remaining armored divisions: Tigers, Panthers, assault guns, veteran crews who had survived years of war. On paper, it looked like a final armored fist, capable of punching through any defense. But this concentration of strength masked a fatal weakness. Germany no longer had the fuel, spare parts, or air support needed to sustain a deep breakthrough. Tanks arrived at the front with barely enough fuel for the first phase of the attack. Ammunition stocks were limited. Replacement crews were poorly trained. Even so, Hitler believed quality could still compensate for quantity. The offensive plan divided the attack into several thrusts, all aimed at splitting Soviet forces and regaining control of the oil fields. The main udar was to be delivered north of Lake Balaton, where German armor would advance through low, marshy terrain toward the Danube. Secondary attacks would fix Soviet reserves and prevent counterattacks. But the terrain itself was already turning against the attackers. Early spring rains transformed fields and roads into seas of mud. Heavy tanks sank, vehicles stalled, supply columns struggled to move at all. German commanders quietly warned that conditions were unsuitable for a rapid offensive. Their concerns were dismissed. Orders were clear. The attack would go forward regardless of weather, losses, or reality. What Germany was about to launch was not a flexible operation, but a rigid all-or-nothing gamble. And once it began, there would be no second chance. The attack began before dawn on March 6, 1945. Under the cover of darkness and mist, German artillery opened fire along the Soviet lines north of Lake Balaton. For the first time in months, the Wehrmacht was not retreating, it was advancing. Columns of tanks moved forward, engines straining as they pushed through mud and broken roads. Infantry followed in their tracks, expecting a breakthrough that could change everything. In the opening hours, the illusion of success seemed real. German units penetrated the first Soviet defensive belt in several sectors. Some positions were overrun, prisoners were taken. Reports flowed back claiming progress. For commanders desperate to believe, it looked like the offensive was working. But beneath the surface, the situation was already unraveling. Soviet defenses were not thin forward lines. They were layered, elastic, and deliberately designed to absorb the Udar. The first line was meant to fall. It existed to slow the attackers, identify their main thrusts, and force German armor into predictable corridors. As the tanks pushed deeper, they entered pre-registered artillery zones. Anti-tank guns waited in concealed positions. Minefields funneled vehicles into narrow paths. The ground itself became an enemy. Heavy Panthers and Tigers bogged down, struggling to maneuver. Supply trucks fell behind. Fuel shortages worsened by the hour. Meanwhile, Soviet command reacted exactly as planned. Reserves were not rushed forward blindly. They were held back, waiting for the moment when the German attack would lose momentum. And that moment came quickly. By the end of the first day, the offensive had slowed dramatically. Breakthroughs stalled. Units became disorganized. Communication broke down as radios failed and command posts shifted under fire. What had begun as a powerful Udar was turning into a grinding, chaotic struggle. The Red Army had not been surprised. It had been prepared. And the deeper the Germans advanced, the more exposed they became. Operation Spring Awakening was no longer about breaking through. It was about survival. The real danger for the German offensive was not that it slowed, it was that it could not stop. Once committed, the attacking units had no safe way to disengage. Soviet defenses were built not as a wall, but as a trap. Every kilometer gained pulled German forces farther away from their supply bases, deeper into terrain already mapped, measured, and calibrated for destruction. Soviet artillery did not fire continuously. It waited. Batteries held their fire until German armor concentrated, then unleashed sudden, crushing barrages that turned advanced routes into killing zones. Anti-tank guns opened fire at close range, targeting flanks and tracks rather than armor plates. Disabled vehicles blocked roads, forcing others to halt or detour straight into minefields. Recovery crews were wiped out before they could work. Fuel shortages became critical. Tanks that survived combat simply stopped moving. Meanwhile, Soviet air power hunted relentlessly. Low-flying attack aircraft struck columns, bridges, and supply depots, severing lifelines faster than German engineers could repair them. What made the situation worse was the imbalance of reserves. The Wehrmacht had committed almost everything it had to this single gamble. The Red Army had not. Fresh rifle divisions, tank corps, and artillery units waited behind the front, prepared for the moment to strike. And when it came suddenly. On March 10th, Soviet counterattacks erupted across multiple sectors simultaneously. This was not a frontal assault, it was a series of precise strikes aimed at the flanks and rear of advancing German formations. Units that had pushed forward now found themselves attacked from the sides. Command posts were overrun, routes of retreat vanished under artillery fire. German commanders reported confusion bordering on collapse. Orders to regroup never reached the front. Some units continued advancing, unaware they were already encircled. Others attempted to withdraw, only to discover that ground they had crossed days earlier was now impassable. The offensive had turned into a pocket, but unlike earlier encirclements, this one was self-created. Operation Spring Awakening was bleeding itself to death. And still, the order stood: advance. By mid-March 1945, the illusion was gone. Operation Spring Awakening was no longer an offensive, it was a collapse unfolding in slow motion. German tank divisions that once led blitzkrieg now sat immobilized in mud and wreckage. Fuel never arrived. Ammunition was rationed, shell by shell. Crews slept inside frozen vehicles, knowing that if Soviet artillery found them at dawn, there would be no escape. The breakthrough to the Danube never came. Instead, German formations were ground down by relentless attrition. Soviet artillery intensified, striking assembly areas and crossroads with precision. There were no reckless counterattacks. Every Soviet move was prepared and overwhelming. German radio traffic revealed panic. Requests to withdraw were denied. Hitler still forbade retreat. On March 15th, the Red Army launched its counteroffensive. Tank corps smashed into weakened flanks. Infantry sealed breaches before German commanders could react. Entire battalions vanished in hours. Meltwater flooded trenches. Roads collapsed. Heavy vehicles sank until only turrets remained above the mud. Soviet soldiers later described the battlefield as a graveyard of steel. What made the defeat irreversible was timing. This was the last major armored operation the Wehrmacht would ever attempt. There were no reserves left. Every tank destroyed here was one less defending Vienna, one less standing between the Red Army and Central Europe. By March 16th, the offensive was halted. The initiative was lost forever. Germany's final gamble ended not with a decisive blow, but with exhaustion and the realization that the war could no longer be turned. The true cost of Operation Spring Awakening was not measured only in destroyed tanks. It was measured in time, the one resource Germany no longer had. In less than 2 weeks, the Wehrmacht lost what remained of its armored strength in Hungary. Elite divisions were reduced to skeletal formations, some holding front lines with fewer than 10 operational vehicles. Fuel shortages became absolute. Tanks were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they were empty. Ammunition dumps were obliterated by airstrikes. Communications collapsed. Entire units disappeared without orders or reports. But the most devastating loss was psychological. The failure at Lake Balaton shattered the last belief that the front could still be stabilized. The Red Army was no longer reacting, it was dictating the war. Soviet forces exploited the collapse immediately. Defensive lines that existed only on maps were overrun before they could be occupied. Hungary ceased to be a battlefield and became a corridor. Vienna stood exposed. There would be no armored shield left in Austria or Czechoslovakia. For the soldiers who survived, the realization was brutal. They had been sacrificed for nothing. No oil secured, no delay achieved, only losses. Operation Spring Awakening was meant to be Germany's final statement of strength. Instead, it became its confession of defeat. From this moment on, the southern axis of the war was no longer a battlefield, it was a countdown. Germany had one last chance, one last gamble, one final strike, and they blew it. Tanks sank in mud. Crews ran out of fuel. Orders came, keep moving. They couldn't, they were trapped. The Red Army was waiting, calm, prepared, lethal. Every step the Germans took, they fell deeper into a trap. By mid-March 1945, the illusion was gone. The final armored fist wasn't a fist at all. It was a corpse, a graveyard of steel. No breakthrough, no glory, no miracle, only exhaustion, only chaos, only defeat. Hungary fell, Vienna was exposed, the road to Berlin, wide open, and the Reich, broken beyond repair. Operation Spring Awakening didn't just fail, it screamed defeat, loud, brutal, unavoidable. This was the moment the war became irreversible. The last gamble lost, the final curtain falling on Nazi Germany. And for anyone watching, history doesn't forgive hesitation. It doesn't reward false hope. It waits and it hits hard.